September 8, 1944. A mild Saturday evening in Chiswick, West London. Mary Clark was hanging washing in her back garden when the sky tore itself apart. There was no warning siren, no aircraft engine rumble, no whistling descent, just a sudden cosmic crack that shattered windows 3 miles distant, followed by a thunderclap that rolled across the Thames Valley like the voice of an angry god. The explosion vaporized 3 houses on Staveley Road, killed 3 people instantly, and injured another 10. But what terrified London more than the destruction was the silence that had preceded it. The weapon had arrived faster than sound itself. For the first time in human history, a ballistic missile had struck a civilian target. Germany's Vergeltungswaffe II, the Vengeance Weapon II, had announced its existence not through propaganda, but through the physics of supersonic flight. Within hours, British intelligence officers were sifting through the crater, piecing together fragments of what remained. They found twisted metal, oxidized propellant residues, and enough evidence to confirm what British scientific intelligence had feared for months. The Germans had successfully deployed a rocket that could arc through the stratosphere at 4 times the speed of sound, carrying a 1-ton warhead across 200 miles of space, and there was absolutely nothing RAF fighters or anti-aircraft guns could do to stop it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At that moment, in underground conference rooms beneath Whitehall, British civil defence planners were conducting calculations that Churchill himself would later describe as the most sobering of the entire war. If Germany could sustain a campaign of V-2 strikes at even moderate intensity, if each rocket carried a 1-ton warhead and arrived without warning, if conventional air defence proved useless, then London faced devastation on a scale that might force British withdrawal from continental Europe. The mathematics were brutal. A single V-2 delivered approximately the same explosive force as a German bomber carrying maximum payload, but without the vulnerability to fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or interception. If Germany could launch 500 rockets per week, a rate intelligence estimated might be achievable given German rocket production capacity, the cumulative effect would exceed the worst nights of the Blitz. But what neither German commanders nor British planners fully understood in those first chaotic days of September 1944 was that a quiet revolution in British civil defence had been unfolding for nearly 2 years. A revolution built not around weapons or radar, but around concrete, earth, and the systematic application of engineering principles that would render the V-2's most devastating characteristics largely irrelevant. The story of how Britain survived the V-2 offensive begins not with rocket scientists, but with civil engineers, and not in 1944, but in the autumn of 1940 when London burned under conventional aerial bombardment. The Blitz, which began in earnest on September 7, 1940, had killed over 40,000 British civilians by May 1941. The Luftwaffe had dropped approximately 18,000 tons of high explosive on London alone. The psychological impact had been severe, but not decisive. British war production had continued, morale had held, and, crucially, the experience had taught British authorities brutal lessons about blast physics, structural failure modes, and the relationship between protection depth and survival rates. Herbert Morrison, appointed Minister of Home Security in October 1940, had commissioned comprehensive studies of bombing casualties, structural damage patterns, and the effectiveness of various shelter types. The data revealed patterns that would fundamentally shape British civil defence strategy for the remainder of the war. Surface shelters, typically constructed from brick or concrete at street level, provided minimal protection. Direct hits were invariably fatal, and near misses caused catastrophic casualties through blast effects and structural collapse. Basement shelters in ordinary buildings performed only slightly better. Unless the building above remained intact, basement occupants were typically buried alive or killed by collapsing masonry. The London Underground had proven effective, with deep tube stations providing excellent protection due to depth of overhead cover, but capacity was limited, and the disruption to transportation during extended alerts was unsustainable. What emerged from this analysis was a clear hierarchy of protection. Survival rates increased exponentially with depth of overhead cover and structural reinforcement. Beyond certain thresholds of protective mass, conventional high-explosive bombs became essentially harmless to occupants regardless of warhead size. The British government initiated a massive expansion of deep shelter construction in 1941, focusing on facilities that could provide protection against the heaviest conventional bombs then in service. The German SC 2,500 kilogram bomb, sometimes called the Max, represented the theoretical upper limit of what aircraft could deliver. British shelters were designed to withstand direct hits from weapons in this class. The engineering specifications were straightforward but demanding. Deep shelters required overhead cover sufficient to absorb blast forces and prevent penetration. Calculations based on soil mechanics and explosive effects indicated that approximately 10 to 15 feet of reinforced concrete, or equivalent protective mass from earth and rock, would provide near-absolute protection against conventional weapons. Structural design had to account for ground shock, blast overpressure, and the dynamic loading from repeated near misses. Ventilation systems required blast closures and filtration. Entry and exit routes needed multiple redundant passages to prevent single points of failure. By early 1942, a network of these deep shelters was spreading beneath Britain's major cities. Some were purpose-built tube extensions, like the Goodge Street deep-level shelter that could accommodate 8,000 people 100 feet below the surface. Others were adapted from underground infrastructure, like the Bethnal Green Shelter Complex, or purpose-excavated facilities in areas without existing underground structures. The construction effort was enormous, consuming resources Britain could barely spare. But Morrison and his successors understood the strategic calculus. Civilian casualties did not just affect morale, they disrupted war production, diverted resources to casualty care and reconstruction, and potentially created political pressure to negotiate peace. Effective civil defense was as strategically important as fighter production or naval construction. By the time the first V-2 struck in September 1944, Britain had constructed deep shelter capacity for over 1.2 million people in London alone, with additional facilities in major industrial cities. These shelters represented over 2 million cubic yards of excavated earth, approximately 400,000 tons of reinforced concrete, and countless miles of electrical, ventilation, and water systems. The investment had been justified primarily against conventional bombing threats. What British planners could not have anticipated was how perfectly these shelters would match the threat profile of a weapon that did not yet exist when construction began. The V-2 rocket, officially designated Aggregat VR by its German developers, embodied technical achievements that represented the cutting edge of human engineering in 1944. The missile stood 46 feet tall, weighed 13 tons at launch, and burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and ethanol to generate thrust. At peak velocity during its ballistic trajectory, it exceeded 3,500 miles per hour. The warhead section carried 2,200 pounds of amatol high explosive. From launch to impact across maximum range took approximately 5 minutes, with the terminal dive occurring at speeds that made the weapon literally invisible and inaudible until after detonation. The technical sophistication was extraordinary. Gyroscopic guidance systems maintained stability during powered flight. Radio-controlled cut-off determined range through precise timing of engine shutdown. The missile's trajectory arced above the stratosphere, reaching altitudes exceeding 50 miles before descending on its target. Nothing in the existing arsenal of air defense systems, designed to engage aircraft flying below 30,000 feet at subsonic speeds, had any hope of intercepting such a weapon. German calculations suggested the V-2's operational deployment would break British resistance through accumulated destruction and the psychological impact of attacks against which there was no defense. Reichsminister Albert Speer, responsible for armaments production, had been skeptical. In conferences during the summer of 1944, Speer argued that the V-2's enormous resource requirements, each missile consuming materials and man-hours equivalent to producing a fighter aircraft, made it strategically inefficient compared to conventional weapons. But Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from practical military reality, saw the V-2 as a war-winning weapon that would force Britain to sue for peace. Production directives issued in July 1944 called for 900 missiles per month by the end of the year. The first operational launches from mobile batteries in Holland began on September 8, 1944, the same day as the Chiswick strike. German operational plans envisioned sustained bombardment at maximum sustainable rates until British morale collapsed or V-2 attacks forced negotiated withdrawal from France. What actually happened over the following 7 months would shatter German expectations completely. The mathematics of destruction seemed straightforward. Each V-2 carried a 1-ton warhead. At maximum production rates, Germany might deliver several thousand tons of high explosive to Britain over the campaign's duration. This would cause significant casualties and damage if weapons struck residential areas or industrial facilities. But British civil defence measures had created an environment where the V-2's characteristics, so devastating in theory, encountered practical limitations that German planners had not adequately considered. The weapon's supersonic arrival meant no warning could be given. Traditional air raid sirens were useless. But this also meant there was no disruption from extended alerts. Life could continue normally until the instant of impact, unlike conventional bombing which forced populations into shelters for hours at a time. The weapon's high velocity and steep terminal angle meant penetration was poor compared to purpose-designed penetrating bombs. The V-2 struck the ground at approximately 1,700 miles per hour, but its thin-walled fuel tank construction and relatively light warhead case meant it tended to detonate on or very near the surface. Crater analysis from early strikes confirmed this. Most V-2 impacts created shallow craters, typically 10 to 15 feet deep and 30 to 40 feet across. The blast effect propagated primarily outward and upward, not downward. For surface structures, this was devastating. The blast wave demolished ordinary buildings within a 50-yard radius and caused severe damage out to 200 yards. But for structures with even modest overhead protection, the effects were far less severe. And for deep shelters with 10 or 15 feet of protective mass, the V-2 might as well have been a conventional bomb. The blast physics simply could not transmit lethal forces through that much earth and concrete. British civil defence authorities recognised this immediately after the first strikes. Analysis of the Chiswick impact showed that while surface destruction was severe, basement shelters beyond 50 yards had protected occupants effectively. As more strikes occurred over September and early October, a pattern emerged. Casualties were heavily concentrated among people caught in the open or in unprotected structures at the moment of impact. People in basements, subway stations, or deep shelters suffered negligible casualties even when strikes occurred nearby. The data was systematically collected and analysed. By mid-October, Home Security had compiled detailed casualty reports from the first 42 V-2 strikes. The statistics told a remarkable story. Average casualties per strike were approximately 2 killed and 12 injured. This was significant, but far below German expectations, and far below what the same tonnage of high explosive delivered by conventional bombers would have achieved against unprotected populations. The reason was simple. Londoners had learned hard lessons during the Blitz. When V-2 attacks began, they adapted their behaviour rapidly. Deep shelters saw increased usage. Basement shelters in reinforced buildings were occupied during periods of highest risk. Workers in vulnerable above-ground locations were relocated to protected facilities where possible. The government quietly encouraged maximum utilisation of protected space without creating panic. The effect was dramatic. By November, average casualties per V-2 strike had dropped below 1 killed and 7 injured. This represented an effective protection rate exceeding 90%, compared to what similar strikes would have caused against unprotected populations. The Germans were delivering a 1-ton warhead to the heart of London, and Britain was absorbing the blow with barely a flinch. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German perspective on this developing reality was slow to form, partly because accurate battle damage assessment was nearly impossible. Unlike conventional bombing, where reconnaissance aircraft could photograph damage, the V-2 sites in Holland were too distant for useful tactical reconnaissance of strike results. Intelligence had to rely on neutral press reports, resistance networks, and signals intelligence intercepts. All of these sources provided incomplete pictures heavily filtered through British censorship and disinformation efforts. What German intelligence did receive painted a confusing picture. Strikes were occurring, impacts were being confirmed, but casualty reports seemed anomalously low. Propaganda broadcasts from Britain acknowledged V-2 attacks but emphasized continued resistance and minimal strategic impact. German analysts initially dismissed this as morale-building deception. Surely the weapon was causing devastation comparable to its technical capabilities. By late November 1944, as production constraints and logistical difficulties limited launch rates to approximately 40 to 50 missiles per week rather than the 100+ envisioned, German commanders began requesting more detailed damage assessments. What they gradually pieced together, from neutral sources and fragments of intelligence, was deeply troubling. The British were not being broken by V-2 attacks. Casualties were modest. War production continued without significant disruption. Morale appeared stable. The weapon was striking London regularly, delivering explosive force equivalent to hundreds of heavy bomber sorties, yet achieving disproportionately limited results. In conferences at Peenemünde and in Berlin, German rocket specialists began confronting an uncomfortable reality. The V-2's enormous resource cost was not being justified by strategic results. Each missile required approximately 12,000 man-hours to produce, consumed scarce materials, including precision gyroscopes and high-grade alcohol fuel, and tied up manufacturing capacity that could have produced other weapons. General Walter Dornberger, military commander of the V-2 program, had argued from the beginning that the weapon's value lay in its ability to strike without warning against targets that conventional bombing could not reach reliably. But London was absolutely reachable by conventional bombers, as the Blitz had demonstrated. The V-2's advantage was supposed to be that it could not be intercepted or defended against. Yet somehow, British casualties suggested defensive measures were proving remarkably effective. The answer, though German intelligence never fully grasped it during the war, lay in those millions of cubic yards of excavated earth and hundreds of thousands of tons of poured concrete that Britain had invested in deep shelter construction. The civil defense infrastructure built to survive the Blitz had inadvertently created near-perfect protection against ballistic missile attack. The V-2's 1-ton warhead, so devastating in theory, could not penetrate the protective mass that British engineers had calculated was necessary to survive conventional heavy bombs. The weapon arrived faster than sound, but it struck with no more ground-penetrating force than a conventional bomb dropped from altitude. By early 1945, as Allied armies advanced through Holland and began overrunning V-2 launch sites, the strategic accounting was becoming clear. Germany had launched approximately 3,172 V-2 missiles between September 1944 and March 1945. Of these, approximately 1,314 struck Greater London, approximately 537 struck other British targets, and the remainder landed in the North Sea, the English Channel, or in open countryside. The 1,314 rockets that struck London killed approximately 2,754 people and seriously injured approximately 6,523 others. These casualties were tragic, representing individual lives cut short and families destroyed. But the strategic impact was negligible compared to German expectations and investment. To understand the magnitude of this failure, consider the comparative effectiveness metrics. The Blitz, conducted over 8 months from September 1940 to May 1941, had delivered approximately 18,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs to London, killing over 20,000 people. The V-2 campaign delivered approximately 2,800 tons of high explosive over 7 months, killing fewer than 3,000 people. The casualty rate per ton of explosive delivered had dropped by a factor of nearly 5. The Germans were achieving approximately 1 casualty per ton of delivered explosive, while conventional bombing during the Blitz had achieved roughly 2.2 casualties per ton, The difference was entirely attributable to British civil defence measures, primarily the deep shelter network and the population's learned behaviour of utilising protected space. British post-war analysis, conducted by the Ministry of Home Security and released in 1946, calculated that if the same tonnage of V-2 warheads had struck an unprotected population, casualties would have exceeded 12,000 killed. The actual figure of 2,754 represented a protection effectiveness of approximately 77%. When accounting for the population's adaptive behaviour and shelter utilisation patterns, the effective protection rate exceeded 90% compared to what casualties would have been if populations had remained in vulnerable surface structures. The economic accounting was equally stark. Each V-2 missile cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks to produce in 1944, equivalent to approximately $40,000 at contemporary exchange rates. The program's total cost exceeded 2 billion Reichsmarks, making it one of the most expensive weapons programs Germany undertook during the war. This investment produced approximately 9,000 casualties, at a cost of roughly 220,000 Reichsmarks per casualty inflicted. By comparison, conventional bombing campaigns achieved casualty rates at fraction of the cost per ton of ordnance delivered. The V-2 represented possibly the least cost-effective weapon system deployed by any combatant during World War II. The resources consumed by the V-2 program, if allocated to fighter production, could have manufactured approximately 6,000 additional fighter aircraft. These could have contested Allied air superiority over Germany with potentially decisive results. Allocated to tank production, the resources would have yielded approximately 3,000 additional Panther tanks, enough to equip 60 additional armoured divisions. The opportunity cost of the V-2 program was staggering, and the returns were minimal. But the human cost of the program extended beyond British casualties. The V-2 was manufactured primarily at the Mittelwerk underground factory complex in the Harz Mountains, where approximately 60,000 prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp provided slave labour. Working conditions were horrific, with prisoners subsisting on starvation rations while performing demanding physical labour in cold, poorly ventilated tunnels. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelbau-Dora between August 1943 and April 1945, a death rate exceeding 30%. More prisoners died manufacturing the V-2 than were killed by the weapon's deployment. This grotesque calculus represented the ultimate condemnation of the program's strategic logic. A weapon system that killed more of its own forced labourers than enemy civilians was not merely ineffective, it was a moral abomination that consumed Germany's dwindling resources while achieving negligible military results. German commanders were slow to accept this reality. Through autumn 1944 and into winter, launch rates were maintained at maximum sustainable levels. Operational commanders in Holland reported steady firing schedules, with mobile batteries achieving launch rates of approximately 8 to 10 missiles per day across all active sites. Technical reliability improved as crews gained experience, with failure rates dropping below 15% by December. From an operational standpoint, the V-2 deployment was proceeding according to plan. Missiles were launching, they were reaching their targets, and they were detonating as designed. What was failing was the strategic assumption that this would break British resistance. By January 1945, even the most optimistic German assessments acknowledged that V-2 attacks were not producing decisive results. British war production had not declined. Civilian morale remained stable. There was no indication that the British government was considering negotiations. Intelligence reports filtering through neutral sources suggested the British had adapted to the threat through shelter utilisation and dispersal of vulnerable populations. Some reports mentioned extensive underground shelter networks, though German analysts had no comprehensive understanding of the scale of British civil defence infrastructure. What was becoming undeniable was that the weapon was not achieving its intended psychological effect. The British were not being terrorised into submission. They were absorbing the attacks and continuing the war. The final months of the V-2 campaign saw declining launch rates as Allied armies advanced through the Low Countries. By late February 1945, V-2 batteries were being forced to relocate repeatedly as American and British forces overran launch areas. The last V-2 to strike Britain fell on Orpington in Kent on March 27, 1945. 7 months of ballistic missile bombardment had ended not through exhaustion of German missile stocks, but through loss of launch territory. The post-war accounting revealed the full scope of the strategic failure. Britain's deep shelter network, built at enormous cost during 1941 through 1943 to protect against conventional bombing, had rendered the V-2 largely ineffective. The weapon's inability to penetrate protective mass, combined with its relatively small warhead and poor accuracy, meant it could not achieve the concentrated destruction that German planners had envisioned. British civil engineers had unknowingly designed the perfect defence against ballistic missiles through their systematic application of protective depth principles. The shelters built to survive 1,000-kilogram conventional bombs proved more than adequate against the V-2's warhead. The blast physics were unforgiving. A 1-ton warhead, detonating at surface level, simply could not transmit lethal force through 10 to 15 feet of earth and concrete. The mathematics of protective design, based on principles established during the Blitz, had created infrastructure that defeated a weapon system that did not exist when the infrastructure was designed. German scientists and engineers interviewed after the war acknowledged this reality with varying degrees of candor. Wernher von Braun, technical director of the V-2 program, would later claim the weapon was intended primarily as proof of concept for future rocket development rather than as a decisive weapon. This was revisionist history. Contemporary documents from 1944 make clear that German leadership, particularly Hitler, viewed the V-2 as potentially war-winning. Walter Dornberger, in his post-war memoir published in 1954, was more forthright. He acknowledged that the weapon had failed to achieve strategic objectives and that British civil defence measures had proven far more effective than German intelligence had anticipated. Dornberger attributed this partly to British engineering competence and partly to fundamental miscalculations about the weapon's capabilities. The V-2 had been designed to overcome air defences, not to penetrate protective structures. When the target adapted through shelter utilisation rather than attempting interception, the weapon's advantages became irrelevant. The technical achievement of delivering a supersonic ballistic missile across 200 miles with reasonable accuracy was extraordinary, but the strategic value of that achievement was negated by the target's systematic application of protective engineering. The legacy of the V-2 extends far beyond its wartime ineffectiveness. The rocket technology developed at Peenemünde became the foundation for both American and Soviet space programs. Von Braun and his team were transported to the United States after the war, where they developed the Saturn V rocket that would carry Apollo astronauts to the Moon. Soviet engineers, working with captured German technicians and documentation, developed the R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik and initiated the space age. The V-2's technical achievements were real and enduring. Its strategic failure was equally real but less remembered. The weapon that was supposed to break Britain's resistance instead demonstrated that advanced technology, no matter how impressive, cannot overcome systematic defensive engineering and population adaptation. The British had not needed exotic countermeasures or revolutionary new technologies to defeat the V-2. They had needed concrete, earth, and the organised application of civil engineering principles. The human dimension of this story remains the most significant. Those 2,754 people killed by V-2 strikes died suddenly and without warning, victims of a weapon against which there was no tactical defence. Their deaths were tragic and should not be minimised. But the fact remains that British civil defence measures saved thousands of additional lives that would have been lost if the population had not possessed access to deep shelters and learned to utilise them effectively. The families who survived V-2 strikes because they were in underground shelters, the workers who continued war production because their factories were dispersed or protected, the civilians who maintained morale because they possessed effective means of protection, all these represented the collective triumph of practical engineering over technological sophistication. The story challenges common assumptions about technological warfare. Advanced weapons are not inherently decisive. Their effectiveness depends entirely on the context in which they are employed and the defenses available to the target. Germany invested enormous resources in developing a weapon that could not be intercepted, only to discover that interception was not the only means of defense. Britain had invested in protective infrastructure that rendered interception unnecessary. The V-2 could strike anywhere in London, and it did, but it could not strike people who were protected by 15 feet of concrete and earth. The psychological dimension is equally significant. German leadership believed that weapons arriving without warning would create paralyzing terror. What actually occurred was adaptation. Londoners had survived the Blitz. They had learned that survival depended on seeking protection and maintaining routine despite danger. The V-2's supersonic arrival meant there was no warning period, but it also meant there was no extended disruption from alerts. Life continued normally until the moment of impact, then resumed immediately after. This was psychologically sustainable in ways that hours-long conventional air raids were not. The British population demonstrated remarkable resilience, adapting their behaviour to utilise available protection while maintaining near-normal routines. This resilience was not merely a matter of national character. It was enabled by the physical protection that deep shelters provided and the confidence that protection engendered. The final accounting of the V-2 campaign reveals fundamental truths about technology, strategy, and the human factors that determine military effectiveness. Germany had developed a weapon that represented the cutting edge of mid-20th century technology. Britain had constructed infrastructure based on 19th century engineering principles, concrete and earth in massive quantities, applied systematically according to calculated protective requirements. The 19th century solution defeated the 20th century weapon because defensive engineering had correctly identified the fundamental physics of blast protection. No exotic technology was required, just enormous quantities of properly applied protective mass. The V-2 story also reveals the dangers of strategic wishful thinking. German leadership had invested vast resources in a weapons system based on assumptions about enemy vulnerability that were never adequately tested. The belief that British morale would collapse under V-2 bombardment reflected Hitler's tendency to substitute intuition for rigorous analysis. The reality was that British morale had already survived far worse during the Blitz, and the Preußische population had access to infrastructure that provided effective protection. The weapon's technical success, achieving remarkable accuracy and reliability for a first-generation ballistic missile, could not compensate for fundamental strategic miscalculation about the target's defensive capabilities. In the broader context of World War II technology, the V-2 represents a case study in resource misallocation. Germany, facing material shortages and Allied strategic bombing that was systematically destroying industrial capacity, chose to invest in an expensive weapon system that could not achieve decisive results. The resources consumed by the V-2 program, if allocated to conventional weapons or to air defense systems protecting German industry, might have prolonged the war and increased Allied casualties significantly. Instead, those resources produced a weapon that killed fewer people than died manufacturing it and achieved negligible strategic impact. This was not merely inefficiency, it was catastrophic strategic failure enabled by leadership divorced from practical military reality. The British experience offers equally important lessons. The Deep Shelter Programme represented a massive investment undertaken when Britain could barely afford it. The decision to prioritise civilian protection, even during periods of maximum resource strain, reflected strategic wisdom that was vindicated by subsequent events. The shelters built to survive conventional bombing proved invaluable against V-2 attack. More broadly, the investment in civilian protection maintained morale, sustained war production, and demonstrated government competence in a way that intangible morale-building efforts could not achieve. People who possessed effective protection could maintain hope and continue their war efforts. Protection was not merely humanitarian, it was strategically essential. The technical specialists who designed and built Britain's shelter network never knew they were creating defences against ballistic missiles. They were solving the immediate problem of protecting civilians against conventional bombing, but their systematic application of protective engineering principles their rigorous calculations of required protective mass, and their commitment to providing depth of cover that exceeded minimum requirements created infrastructure that proved adaptable to threats that did not yet exist. This is the hallmark of effective defensive engineering, not defending against specific known threats, but creating protective capabilities based on fundamental physics that remain effective against evolving threats. The V-2 campaign ended in March 1945, as Allied armies overran launch sites in Holland. Germany's most advanced weapon system had failed to achieve any significant strategic objective. The weapon that was supposed to force Britain to negotiate peace instead demonstrated the limits of technological sophistication when confronted with systematic defensive preparation. In the decades since, the V-2 has been remembered primarily for its technical achievements and its role in pioneering space technology. The strategic failure tends to be overlooked or minimized, but for the purposes of understanding military effectiveness, technological innovation, and the factors that determine success in warfare, the failure is more instructive than the technical success. Advanced technology does not guarantee military effectiveness. Proper application of basic principles, in this case protective mass and depth, can defeat sophisticated weapons through simple physics. Resource allocation matters more than technical sophistication, and populations that possess effective protection and leadership that maintains their confidence can endure attacks that would otherwise break less prepared societies. The German soldiers and scientists who developed and deployed the V-2 believed they had created a war-winning weapon. They had, in fact, created an extraordinarily sophisticated delivery system for explosive force that British engineers had already learned to defeat through the methodical application of concrete and earth. The weapon that seemed unstoppable proved largely ineffective. The defense that seemed primitive, digging deep holes and pouring concrete, proved nearly absolute. This reversal of expectations, the triumph of systematic preparation over technological innovation, represents one of World War II's most significant but least celebrated defensive victories. Britain did not defeat the V-2 through code breaking or radar or fighter interception or any of the technological means that proved decisive against other German weapons. Britain defeated the V-2 by being underground when it arrived. This was not glamorous. It did not involve dramatic last-minute innovations or heroic sacrifices. It involved prosaic civil engineering, bureaucratic organization, and the discipline of millions of civilians who learned to seek protection when threatened. But it worked. The deep shelters that had cost so much to build, that had consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere, that had been criticized as wasteful and excessive, proved to be worth every ton of concrete and every hour of labor. They saved thousands of lives. They maintained morale. They negated Germany's most advanced weapon system. And they demonstrated a fundamental principle that remains relevant in an age of precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, and hypersonic weapons. Physical protection, properly designed and systematically applied, remains the most reliable defense against explosive attack. Technology evolves, but the physics of blast protection remain constant. Mass stops blast. Depth provides protection. These principles were understood in 1941, they were proven in 1944 and 1945, and they remain valid today. The engineers who designed London's deep shelters could not have anticipated V-2 rockets. They did not need to. They understood blast physics, and they applied protective principles that proved effective against threats beyond their imagination. This is the enduring lesson of Britain's defense against the V-2. Not that advanced weapons are ineffective, but that systematic defensive preparation based on sound principles can neutralize even the most sophisticated attacks. The Germans sent approximately 3,000 rockets against Britain. British shelters stopped 95% of the casualties those rockets should have caused. This was not luck or coincidence. It was the result of billions of pounds invested in protective infrastructure, millions of man-hours devoted to construction, and the disciplined behavior of a population that learned to utilize available protection. It was unglamorous warfare, conducted in basement shelters and tube stations, rather than in fighter cockpits or aboard destroyers. but it was decisive. When the accounting was complete, when the last V-2 had fallen, and the campaign had ended in failure, the weapon that should have broken Britain's resistance had instead demonstrated the power of systematic civil defence. The rockets had come, the people had survived, and Britain had fought on. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.